Hi everyone, Science illustrator and artist Mattias Lanas here. In this episode, I'm taking a close look at a large format painting by artist-explorer Tony Foster called Fall Color in Great Meadow, Concord. He painted this in 2012 as part of a canoeing trip in New England in the northeastern United States. There were two people close to Tony Foster who told him that the fall color in New England is one of the most beautiful spectacles in the world, and this prompted him to create paintings of this region for inclusion in his Exploring Beauty Watercolor Diaries from the Wild Journey. The first of these painting site luminaries is Parker Huber, an author and longtime friend and travel companion of Foster's from Maine. The other is environmental activist Peggy Brace from Massachusetts, who also lent Foster a canoe to travel along the Concord River to create his paintings for his Thoreau's Country Journey in 1984. This large piece was created at a place alongside the Concord River called the Great Meadow, a very marshy area where Foster was able to fully immerse himself in autumn-colored vegetation. Take a look at the souvenir section of this artwork. Foster's painted an arranged series of found leaves forming a color gradient from brown to green to yellow to orange and red. These leaves are exquisite to look at, and they form the inspiration for today's episode. If you're following along with this demonstration, you may use your own colorful leaf, ideally one that lays flat, or reference mine directly. Take a look at all these rich colors. I find leaves like this to be really fun subjects to paint, especially in the beginning when I'm working with wet and wet watercolors. They're very playful subjects. We start with a watercolor foundation that matches the overall color gradients and blotches that we see here, and then work smaller and drier over time to incorporate the veins, imperfections, and other details. The emphasis in this demonstration is on color and form rather than on volume and light and shadow. If you're following along today, make sure to have first watched my materials video to get a sense of what supplies I'll be using. I'll use a basic watercolor painting setup, including watercolor paper, a sharp pencil and eraser, water, watercolor paints and brushes, and paper towel. Make sure to also have your leaf or the reference photo of mine handy. Let's get going. As usual, I've started with a drawing of my subject, in this case, this leaf that I'm going to be painting, and I've made sure to put plenty of time into this drawing so I feel good about the way this leaf presents. If I rush the drawing stage and don't put the time into getting the proportions right and the feel of this leaf just as it is beforehand, then I'm not going to feel satisfied with the results after I finish the watercolor. I'm going to work on this painting layering up watercolors from my lighter colors, my yellows, all the way up to my darker reds and rich browns. There are different approaches for painting subjects like this. Tony Foster, for example, uses a more piecemeal approach, dabbing bits of color over different areas and slowly building those up rather than working on the entire surface at once and then building up successively in layers. Both have their benefits, and I encourage you to try other techniques outside of this video. But for today, I really want to play with the wet and wet technique, where I let the pigments float around on the wet paper surface and interact with each other. After I've done all that, I'm going to be lifting out bits of color to form the veins and other imperfections that we see in here. Although I will stress, I want today's demonstration to be very loose and whimsical, roughly based on this reference, but not copying it exactly. Another thing you'll want to do before you get started is make sure that you understand how your colors flow with each other and interact. For example, in this leaf, we're going to be creating a bunch of oranges besides the red and yellow. We know orange is created with red and yellow, and I can layer those two colors to form a deep, rich orange the way that I want. In this particular palette right here, I have Permanent Rose and Alizarin Crimson as my two reds, and then I have Winsor Yellow and Cadmium Yellow as my yellows. I know that certain combinations of my Permanent Rose and Alizarin Crimson with the Cadmium Yellow specifically result in rich, deep oranges the way that I like. You'll want to do some color tests beforehand, perhaps even with different reds and yellows, to find some oranges that you feel accurately match what you're seeing in the leaves that you're painting. Don't be surprised if after drying, some of your oranges feel a little muted, a little less vivid in color, as this can happen. So just make sure to test those oranges ahead of time, let them dry, and make sure that they match what you're seeing and what you ultimately want for your leaves. So I'll begin by mixing up a cadmium yellow base, so using this yellow here, and just create a bunch of this color since it's going to be the foundation for the yellow parts of the leaf and also the orange And the oranges will be created by adding red on top afterwards. So let me get as much of that off as I can in this little well here. All right, I'm gonna put the rest over here because this will be my orange. This leaf isn't gonna have too much white in it by the end, so I'm gonna do a lot of underpainting with yellow and then maybe lifting later to reveal some whites, but I'm not going to worry too much about covering the whole thing right now. I can test this out, just to see what the cadmium yellow looks like. It's a very bright, warm yellow. And then over here I'll mix up the permanent rose. So the permanent rose is a more magenta type of red. It's this one up here. Get some of that. Put it over here. This works very well with the cadmium yellow. It forms a, in my opinion, it forms a pretty rich orange. And that's easy to just grab more of. So the red and the yellow together make the orange. The red is more overpowering than the yellow, so I'm going to use the rest of this red in here, but I might need to add some more yellow to this. Oh yeah, definitely. To make it more of a yellowy orange rather than a reddy orange. Okay, so I'll take a bit more of the cadmium yellow over here and adding that in here. There we go. So that's more of an orange. It looks pretty vivid. Mix it up well. Let's test that out. And I'm going to leave that to be my orange brush then. And I'll start with a fresh brush. So now to start off, I'm going to layer in some water in here to set my foundation for the wet and wet. But I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to the brush because it's easier to then see where I'm painting in if I have a bit of tint. And again, since I'm not leaving any areas white, this is okay to do. So let's see, get that yellow. It's mostly just water, but that's okay. And I want to be pretty careful as I put this in, just making sure I go all the way up to the edges of the leaf and not going outside of those borders. So take your time doing this. You want to be pretty patient and make sure you're doing it well, since it's our first layer. And again, it doesn't really matter that it's so bright because I want all that color in there anyways. So here we go, working carefully. It helps to turn the paper sometimes to get those angles just right. I'm using the very tip of this brush to get all the way up against the edge. These brushes are great because these round brushes hold a lot of water, and so I don't have to reload with pigment all that often, but they also hold a nice sharp tip, so I can do all this detail work. Making sure the whole thing is staying wet. And so I'm almost done. Now comes the art of understanding moisture content a little bit because I need to let this get dry to the stage where it will let the pigment flow, but the pigment won't just sit on top of the water and kind of float on the top of the page. I want it to set into the fibers of the paper a little bit. So right now it's pretty wet. I can see it's very shiny. And so I want to let it dry just enough so that it starts to enter the paper fibers. In the meantime, I can start mixing up my orange. So basically the orange I already made, I'm just adding the yellow brush to it. I'm going to intensify that, and we can test it now just to see what happens. I think it is still too wet, but since this is such a loose piece, it doesn't really matter to play around. You can see, yeah, so my orange is kind of sitting on top of the yellow. It's not really spreading the way that I want it to, and that's just because it's too wet. Just for consistency, let me add some more to these other tips. And now I'm going to let this dry a little bit longer before I do anything more. I'm wary of this getting too dry. It's dried a bit more, so hopefully I'll have better luck this time. I'm going to reinforce some of the areas that have cadmium yellow. So basically just touching up some of the edges. Oops, went right out my border right there. Letting it be very playful, whimsical, letting the watercolor kind of do its thing. This is the fun part of the wet and wet. And like I said, I'm not really sticking too much to the template of the leaf that I'm referencing. A little bit, but mostly just referencing it for colors and the overall shape. But just dabbing these in, letting that bright, vivid cadmium yellow settle in and form some good foundation for me. can see how it's just kind of flowing. And then I'll take my orange brush that I'd previously mixed up and just start to have fun with that as well. Go all the way up to the tips, fill this in with the orange, and let the orange just kind of do the same thing that the yellow was doing, just playfully spread out throughout the leaf. Alright, that's great. Very, very Halloween type colors for this one. You'll want to be careful if you're working with leaves that have green and yellow and red in them. This one doesn't have very much green or any at all. But if you do have some green in there, the green and the red can very easily muddy and turn into a kind of yucky brown. So you don't want to mix them too much as you layer. Let them flow into one another, but then don't sort of mix them up on the paper. Let them sit and dry as is. Okay, and I gotta work quickly, so now I'm gonna take my yellow brush again, but pick up some of the reds this time and just start dropping those in. Maybe dilute this red a little bit because it's very bright, very intense. There we go. I got a bunch of water on there, and that's okay. Roughly just letting it fill in the same areas in the reference, but if it goes beyond that, that's okay. Look at that. Love that effect. Loose, playful, organic. Get a bit more of that permanent rose, and let's add just a touch of Alizarin Crimson to it. So here I'm just grabbing a little bit of that just to add some nuance to this color, some darkness in there. And especially here at the tips, just touching a little bit of that in. I like to add the imperfections, or what really make the piece come alive, make the colors come alive. Oh, and I love these mottled effects that are coming out of the mixing of the yellows and reds as well. Just emphasizing some of the borders here with this extra dose of red. All right, that's looking pretty good. This is the fun part. It can be a little scary for some people just because it can feel really out of control. But really just go with it. If you mess up, just start fresh with a new leaf and a new drawing, a new painting, and see what happens, and just try to get into the playfulness. So let's leave that for now. I'm going to let this dry before I continue. All right. So this has dried significantly. You can see it's much less shiny now. It's still got some dampness to it, which I'm going to use to my advantage. At the risk of overworking, let me take some more of this permanent rose mixture that I have up here, and let's just dab a little bit more of that to add some more imperfections to certain areas. I can somewhat try to copy this texture that I'm seeing on some of the leaf, but I think I'm going to leave most of it just as is. Be more splotchy than what I'm seeing in this leaf. Cleaning up a little bit of the borders, trying to get that serrated edge back because I lost it in some places. And then I might as well paint in the stem. The stem is very dark, so it doesn't really matter what kind of foundation I have. I think as long as it relates to the colors that are in the leaf itself. So let's use this red here. It's just a rich color. Being careful and patient with this part, using just the tip of this round brush. For the rest, I'll switch to a much smaller, finer brush and take some of the cadmium yellow and add that in as well. Just sort of clean it up a little bit. And I think I'm going to grab some burnt sienna as a further darkening agent. And I can go ahead and just put that right in, no fear. And then how about even a touch of French ultramarine to really deepen that. Let me see if I mix it in here with the burnt sienna. Get something that's closer to a black to darken this up. There we go. There's not a lot going on in this stem, so I don't have to be too careful with the color as long as it's dark. What I do have to be careful about is the shape. I don't want to deviate from the stem shape. And then down here, this part seems a little lighter, so I'll just mix some of this orange in to lighten that mixture, and then paint that in. Maybe a little more yellow. All right, there we go. So I've got that nice gradient going on from lighter tip to darker bit here where it meets the leaf base. Okay, so using the same thin brush, now that this is pretty much dry, I can take some of this dark color I've mixed up. I want to darken this red, so I'm going to mix in some of this burnt sienna into this red that I've got going on. And basically I'm looking at some of the darker areas of the reference photo. You can see up in the leaf tips and then some of the margins, the serrated edge. I have a darker area, so let's get that part now. Since this is dry and I have a detailed brush, let me take some Alizarin Crimson, kind of more of a winey red, mix that in with the burnt sienna. Let's see what that looks like. Just something more of a wine color, a bit darker, maybe a bit more burnt sienna. I'm going to turn this just to make it easier to get in these angles. Just start to add in those details and go right up to the edge so that you reinforce that edge, clean it up as you need to. This is the detail work, the dry detail work part that is also fun. It's just very different than the loose part. And then I'm just going to emphasize some of these serrated edges as well with this color, because to me they kind of stick out in a darker way than the rest. If you're working larger than life, this leaf that I'm painting here is about true to life, so I have to use a tiny brush. But if you're working larger, you can afford to use a larger brush than the one I'm currently using and still get plenty of detail in there. But since I'm working so tiny, I have to be really careful and work with a smaller brush like this. So let's see this one as well. Being careful, but also allowing myself to be a little bit whimsical with this, if I'm not sticking too true to what I'm seeing in the reference photo as far as where I'm putting some of these blobs, but overall just trying to get a feel of the leaf. Okay, I've got a couple up here as well. See some yellow going on these two tips, so let's see if we can just add a bit of this yellow. Normally you want to do the lighter colors first and then layer the darker ones on top, and the yellow is a lighter one, but this yellow is opaque enough that I can do a bit of layering the opposite way, and it works pretty well. Really makes these leaf tips look very dry. Okay, and let's further darken some of these colors. So I have this mixture over here, the burnt sienna and the permanent rose and alizarin crimson mix, but I can add maybe some French ultramarine to that as a darkening agent, maybe to some of it. And I want to darken this tip here, so just adding some variation, some nuance. That bit here, I see a dark blob right here, maybe some darkness along the edge of this rim here. And let me put a tiny bit along the top edge of the stem just to push it back a little further in space. Maybe a tiny bit here too. It's good to have some variation in your darks. And now let's work on some of the veins, the venation that we're seeing in here. I'm not going to do all of them. It's sort of too late for some of that, but that's okay. That wasn't the intention. But I can use a thin brush like this and just do a little bit of lifting in certain places to pull up some of the yellows and reds and emphasize the veins a little bit more. I want to make sure when I'm doing this that I don't oversaturate what I have here, because I don't want I don't want to put a puddle of water down that will then push the pigments away and create some uncontrolled effects like backwashes. But if I have a gently moistened brush, I should be able to lift a little bit of color. It might take a couple passes. Actually, let me try this smaller brush, which is slightly stiffer, so I'll make sure that's clean and dampened off. And I'm wiping my brush off between passes. So just emphasizing that vein area. This is subtle. But it could be cool. Could also ruin this piece. So we shall see what happens. You can see this is revealing some of the whites as well, which is nice. And some of this lifting ability will depend on how workable your paper is. You know, if you have paper that's pretty forgiving, you can do a lot of these passes. But if you do a little too much, and especially with weaker papers, you might end up pulling up some of the paper fiber and sort of ruining the paper. So just be careful. But again, it's all a learning experience. Okay, just a bit more right here where it got a little darker than it is in the reference photo. Something like that. And now maybe a little bit of lifting of these side veins. So again, same kind of thing, not too much, but just every now and then emphasizing some of these lateral veins. Okay, and my color's not wanting to move that much. It's stained the paper in a way where it's not really as workable, and that's okay. So I'm gonna leave it as is for now and just darken certain areas a bit more. One thing I like to do for extra detail is go back to my pencil and just introduce some pencil lines to reinforce edges and also pull out some additional details. And if your paper's just the right moisture, you should be able to actually use the pencil more as a way to indent the paper and leave some texture in it rather than fully just putting down graphite. So let's see if we can do some of that. But I love the crispness that a little extra pencil can add to your watercolor when you do it after the fact like this. Something like that. And now let's take this thin brush and I'll add some more reds. I see more of the reds in this reference photo than the oranges, although I like how this particular one is showing up as a bright orange leaf. Let's go more with the reds. So I'll take the permanent rose again. You can see this very, very much a magenta color. Put some water in that. Let's test it. We don't want it too bright. Oh, it's very bright. More water. Still pretty bright. Let's see if I can dilute it just a bit further. Let's try that, and you can see this over the yellow. Makes a pretty nice orange. So, but since we want it more red, let's add more directly on top of this orange. And now I'm just going to follow some of these veins that I've drawn in and carefully kind of paint between them blobs of this red magenta. fuzzing the edges a bit as they approach the interior. Just keep doing this kind of careful work as much as you feel you want to. I think I want to get a lot more red in here, so I'm going to just continue doing this around. But it's amazing how this magenta over the colors that we built up already just does this perfect, bright, beautiful red. Okay, and then a little more up in this area, emphasizing the edge, the serrated leaf edge. That looks pretty good. And then last thing is I want to emphasize a little bit more of some of the inner veins using just a darker yellow. So I've got my cadmium yellow, and I've got this mixture here that I'm not sure what I put in there, maybe the burnt sienna or an Indian red before. So I just want like a darker yellow. Could even be a yellow ochre that you just take straight from the pan. Let's get my tests again. So something like that. You can see it's just kind of a yucky brown, but it's really a yellow base. And I'll just use that to emphasize some of the shadows that are going on in the veins, capitalizing on where the graphite is now. Little micro veins that I see here, just little details, really thin details that you will only notice up close, but that bring a lot of joy to someone who's looking this closely. You see all this going on in here. All right, and let's call it there. So I've got my fall leaf. I hope that was as fun for you as it was for me. I really do find colorful leaves to be one of the most relaxing and enjoyable subjects to paint, probably because of all that color and because the leaf shapes are so organic and playful. Plus, it's very easy to gather subject material. There are endless shapes and colors to choose from on every tree. Practice filling an entire page with different leaves. You'll learn a lot each time and get better and better at making them come alive on your page. If you like this episode, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. You can view all the other videos in this series on YouTube and also on the Foster website at www.thefoster.org. Thank you for watching.